I think we're live. So let me hi everybody, if there are any people. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to this Substack Live. I'm hoping to get my ass in gear and start doing these weekly. My dear subscribers, please bear with my rebirthing pains. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Jesse Marks. He's the founder of RILA Research and Advisory. Have I got that pronunciation right?
Rihla, but close.
RILA. RILA. He writes Coffee in the Desert, an excellent newsletter about China, Middle East, geopolitics, geoeconomics, conflict, and technology. He's worked as a Middle East policy advisor in the US government, and he regularly participates in multi-track dialogues focused on US, China, and Middle East and North Africa relations. So, I mean, our main topic today is Donald Trump's excellent adventure in the Persian Gulf and what it means for China. But welcome, Jesse. Let's start by asking where you are.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here and great to have the opportunity to connect virtually after I think,
Absolutely.
years of getting to read your work. It's great to be here. Currently in Vietnam at the moment, taking a break from what's about to be a very chilly winter in Australia. So enjoying the warmth.
Yeah. You're headed for Canberra.
Yeah, I'll be heading back to Canberra in a couple of weeks. So
Okay.
by that time, they're entering their autumn period. So a little bit
Yes.
of a mix up having been in the US for the normal.
Yeah.
So getting used to that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when I used to go to Canberra for work, I used to call it the Pyongyang of the Pacific, but it's quite a strange city. It's
It
full of
is.
slums.
See, that's funny because I'm originally from Florida and I call it the Tallahassee of
Ah,
Australia because it's got that same small town vibe. I joke because most people there I've met, like mullets in the back, business in the front, people
mhm.
listen to country music. It feels very southern, but
Right.
very much more with, I think, a bit more of a kind of liberal bend to it. So it's
Right, right,
something.
but the bureaucrats are equally badly dressed in both cities. Maybe it's kind of
Yeah,
floppy suits.
not as bad as DC, but yeah, definitely. Hey, Florida is becoming the new DC, right? Ever since Trump basically moved out of Mar-a-Lago, everyone's setting up shop in Miami. So maybe the
Yeah,
Miami Duke is going to become the new business casual.
we're headed that way, or something worse. So let's get into the meat of things. Actually, before we start with the Middle East, in about 57 minutes, we believe Donald Trump is going to be giving some kind of speech, the State of the Union. Uh, what are you hearing, or what can you say about this?
There was a great quote, I think it was earlier today, at one of the press conferences where he was basically saying, "I'm going to talk about how great I am." So I think that's the general expectation.
Right, right.
A layer underneath that, what that means, I expect we're going to hear some announcements on Iran. Trump's been very vocal about Europe and the EU and NATO, particularly around their lack of involvement in Straits of Hormuz. We can see some
Right.
conversations there. It's really anyone's game. I'm hoping we'll see some more insights into if Trump has gotten the Xi meeting that was delayed a couple weeks back on course, because I think that meeting sets up a lot for anything what we're going to talk about.
And as you understand it, that meeting is not confirmed as previously
Right.
posted by Trump. It hasn't actually been confirmed by the Chinese side, has it?
Exactly. No, I mean, they always hold the veto in that they have to actually extend the invitation, even if there's an expectation or a plan, if the invitation isn't extended, then technically.
Until it's in, I see it in Xinhua black and white. It ain't real. Yeah.
Exactly. But I do think, there were four planned meetings this year. We've kind of passed the first one. But I mean, the next one is the one to look forward to when it comes to if we're going to find any form of potential breakthrough for US and China, whether that's cooperation or even just reaching an understanding on Iran. But I know we'll get into that.
And we're unlikely to get any real insight to that in tonight's speech. I mean, I'm sure we'll just get some kind of rhetorical victory of some kind by, leaving NATO or doing some other destructive thing to distract from the previous destructive thing. But let's go to the destructive thing of the moment that isn't quite over yet, despite Trump's best wishes. Before we, look at Iran and the war, can you give us a quick overview of China's relationships in the Middle East and the Gulf? I realize this is a very complicated thing, and I'm asking you to reduce, a vast area, very diverse, thousands of years of history, et cetera, complicated economic and political relationships to a couple of sound bites, but please.
Yeah, I think the easiest way to look at the Middle East is for China. It is who is it? I heard someone say think it might have been Mohammed Sadeghi in the recent engagement. China is the most popular of the least important places in China's foreign policy. But I think what that really is getting at is for China, the Middle East has always been an economic market. It's always been a priority when it comes to trade relations for energy, but it's never been necessarily a security one. China has built its presence through commerce, through investment, but those have not followed with major security guarantees. And I think that's one of the things that's important to lay down at the front end. And before the current state of war, like Beijing's most important regional relationships were some with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, just because that was where we saw the most investment across the board, everything from AI to, sensitive technology, surveillance technology, trade. Jebel Ali Port has a huge number of Chinese companies operating there. And just generally, kind of they're what we call like all weather, fair weather fans, we call it in the US baseball terminology. But those relationships are good, they're dependable, they're durable. When we look at the relationship between the GCC and Iran, China's trade with the GCC has dwarfed.
And so, can you just let's define the GCC exactly?
Sure, yeah. So the Gulf Cooperation Council is basically Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, basically the countries just south of Iraq, all the way down to Oman, that sit on the western shore of the Straits of Hormuz and of the Persian Gulf.
And these are primarily Sunni Muslim countries.
Yes, so Sunni Arab countries, but even within that, it's not a homogenous identifier, right? You have massive tribal differences, historical differences, colonial legacies, and different structures of government, which I think all play out in really quite unique ways. It's a very dynamic region in itself. But the region was one that, right, historically has been endowed with very rich kind of oil, gas, petrochemical production. Like basically, for the case of Saudi Arabia, you have 75 years of industry that has made the region central to global trade for global industries. You can find petrochemical products from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf virtually in almost every market, whether that's plastics. So it's a pretty central feature of the global market. China has seen and understood that. And we've seen a pretty deepening of ties since around 2019, 2020. China holds a huge strategic partnership agreement with the GCC going back to 2022, I believe it was, when President Xi Jinping visited Saudi Arabia. You saw billions of dollars of investment committed. You have a new China Middle East forum. You have a China GCC forum. So you have a whole structure of relationships that have been put in place that just signal the strength of ties. Everything's Dubai, Abu Dhabi, the UAE alone hosts around 300,000 Chinese nationals. So it's one of the largest overseas Chinese citizen population. So it has an important feature in Chinese foreign policy, especially when compared to the broader Middle East. Iran, on the other hand, occupies a bit of a peculiar place in Chinese foreign policy. Right, it is one of Beijing's important crude suppliers. China buys a lot of Iranian oil at very cheap prices, very steep discounts. And much of that funding is rooted through what we call sanction evasion networks. But basically, China has been a source of cash for the Iranian government, which has been sanctioned by the US and the UN for decades now. But it's interesting because within China's own hierarchy of diplomatic partnerships, Iran is quite strategic for China, but it is still not necessarily its most durable in the region. I like to say sometimes they float between being the lovable partner and the liability. Right. When you look at like neighboring Pakistan, for example, right, China's relationship with Pakistan is much stronger. It exists, even though there may be tensions, even though the US, strikes a major critical mineral deal with Pakistanis, the Chinese are still, co-developing like strategic fight.
I mean, they still call each other Iron Brothers, and
exactly
call each other Iron Brothers, right? So, it's perhaps more akin to North Korea. Then it's a kind of friend, but very spiky friend, or unpredictable friend, or.
In the case of Iran, I think it's kind of a sea urchin. Sorry, someone is beating down the stairs. So I apologize.
It's fine. It could be the apocalypse. The time.
Who knows? But I think, it's like a sea urchin, right? It's really cute to look at, but when it can poke you,
right?
And
handle it right, yeah.
And I think it's important, that distinction, because, up until 2024, 2025, debatable in 12-day war, right, China has had very delicate balancing act between its relationship with the Gulf Arab states, so the GCC countries, and Iran. And it's been able to, what I tend to call like strategic balancing. It's been able to balance their relationship and during periods of conflict, like this is not the first Gulf crisis that we've had. China has basically balanced both sides, doing everything from shuttle diplomacy, going back and forth, the normal Chinese
And even a couple of years ago,
mediation.
wasn't there the Saudi-Iranian sort of accord that was signed in
Exactly.
Yeah,
So that is the 2023, right? This is the pinnacle. And this gets into the geopolitics of the Gulf. Basically, I think this is important to note as we get into this conversation. Prior to this round of conflict in 2025, Saudi Arabia engaged with the UAE and kind of backdoor mediation that was hosted by Oman and Iraq. And those two countries played an important role in pushing the dialogue kind of to the 95 percentile, where China basically was invited in to broker a normalization agreement between the two sides. And, there was a lot of skepticism about whether it would hold. Remarkably, for 2 to 3 years, even through the war in Gaza, through the 12-day war, Saudi Arabia and Iran held to that agreement. There was constant dialogue and engagement. China maintains kind of a trilateral framework where it basically hasn't invited any of the other countries in, but Iran, Saudi Arabia, and China meet, I believe it's on a quarterly basis, to discuss the bilateral relationship. So there is a lot of depth that has been built as a result of China's kind of, I would say, fostering or shepherding their relationship. But again, that's not akin to security guarantees. And we've kind of seen that collapse since the war in Iran this time around. But it puts China in a unique predicament because you now have, China's strategic partner, in a sense, Iran. And I want to go back to 2021, China and Iran signed a 25-year strategic partnership agreement. I believe it was in the tens to hundreds of billions of dollars. That has not really been implemented on China's side, which is telling for a number of reasons, just due to the risk calculation. But you have a strategic partner that's now attacking and carrying out pretty large live fire, hitting critical infrastructure and oil in the Gulf. China's other kind of core economic partner. So it puts China in a unique place. I think something for listeners when it comes to the American equation in this is that Beijing and its involvement in the Middle East is not trying to replicate American hegemony. I think that is a key point that we often miss. Within Chinese
Well, let me stop you there, and let's sort of, I don't know if we're fast forwarding or rewinding. But let's go back to the launch of Operation Epic Fury against Iran on February 28th. So, from Beijing's perspective, what happened, and what are the stakes for China? And then, you say they don't want to replace American hegemony, but what do they want?
I think that's the question that Beijing is currently trying to navigate right now, right? In many cases, this is uncharted water for Beijing, right? Beijing historically prioritizes stability, prioritizes predictability. And in moments of chaos, right, Chinese foreign policy sometimes feels a bit like a dinghy in an ocean of uncertainty, right? It's trying to figure out, okay, where's the solid shore or the land that we can find to be able to build a strong response to. Again, within that visual, which I think is quite interesting, right? Then your oars are public statements, 5-point plans, trying to figure out which direction you go. But I think from the launch of the operation, from Beijing's perspective, and it's just from people that I've engaged with and had a number of conversations with, they generally see the U.S. as doing something profoundly stupid and destabilizing, and ultimately self-defeating. And I think the longer we see this conflict play on, the more we see that narrative around the U.S. basically being self-defeating play out. Even if the U.S. does have a short-term military success, and those successes, I think, in many ways are perceived to be impressive. And just look at what happened in January in Venezuela. Those are not sustainable actions, particularly when you look at their impact on U.S. alliance networks, U.S. supply chains, stockpiles, strategic positionality, if we're talking about in the Asia-Pacific region, with the diversion of U.S. forces out of those areas to the Middle East. So it's an interesting position. It highlights, I think, one of China's largest core insecurities, which is regime change, right? The assassination of the supreme leader, then the targeting of nuclear facilities, right? It's another major one. China's very supportive of non-proliferation movements. And then I think the normal things, hitting of military infrastructure, all this to be expected. But like this kind of regional conflagration is something that Beijing has spent years actively trying to avoid. Now, to the extent that it's putting its skin in the game to try to help that, or to try to help de-escalate, is up for debate. And I think we see that kind of robust kind of discourse happening in Washington and Beijing and different places. The other piece of it I just want to quickly add is not just China's view of the U.S., but China's view of Tehran's response, right? I think there has been China's been very quiet. And naturally, whenever they put out a statement, they do their best not to name names. But there has been a very clear point of frustration, and including when you speak with folks behind the scenes about Iran's lashing out back in the GCC, when the Gulf were very vocal and active and declaring to the Iranians that we are not active in this conflict and we are not using our sovereign territory to support the operations against you. And after the killing of the Ayatollah, there was some really interesting netizens and kind of the Chinese policy sphere discussing basically Beijing's hesitancy when you read China's statement, acknowledging, not necessarily congratulating, but acknowledging the new Iranian leader, that basically their interpretations was this was hesitancy because they were waiting to see whether the new leader will be militant, whether he will divert away from where his father's position was, which was a fatwa against the pursuit of nuclear weapons, despite what the discourse in the West looks like, and basically is most of it going to pursue a bomb with the intent of being able to attack the U.S., Israel, etc. And I think that uncertainty will still continue to factor into China's.
I mean, wouldn't part of the uncertainty just be that, like everybody else, they don't know if he is actually the leader? I mean, we don't even actually know if he's still alive. That must play into it too. I mean, we've seen in Afghanistan, for example, they'll wait for the dust to settle and see who comes out on top, and then they'll negotiate with that person, no matter who it is.
I'm hard struck to believe that the Chinese don't know that answer. I mean,
yeah.
As one of the
Do you think they have enough intelligence inside the Iranian state to know what's going on with the leadership?
I remember having a conversation with someone who was outside of Beijing at the time, who during the it was right after the 12-day war, when I believe the Iranian defense minister went to China as part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, kind of trilateral with the Russians. Person was just asking me quite clearly, like, "Oh, what is your read? Do you think that the U.S. was successful in attacking Fordo?" And I just kind of chuckled, and I was like, "I think you're the one to tell me, because I'm pretty sure the defense minister showed up with an intelligence file that thick about what happened." And even if not, like there, Farrell and Newman, to borrow some academic literature, have this concept called the panopticon effect, right? Which is if you control the kind of the technological infrastructure of the country, you have signal intelligence,
which they do, right? It builds everything.
Well, no, I mean, I'm hard pressed to believe that they do not know if he's alive or not, but also like they probably have a pretty clear idea of what the internal situation looks like.
Yeah, they must do. I mean, just thinking of the telecom network, they must
exactly,
right?
Exactly.
If anyone, they know probably better than most Iranians.
And it's hit them, and I mean, it has hit China in really interesting ways, right? I think the most blatant is Iran's basically weaponization of force to shut down the Straits of Hormuz, right? That does have impacts on China. There are debates to the extent that it does impact China. But even we can look at the second, third, and order effects of that. But basically, if we see the Straits of Hormuz shut down, Russian oil becomes more valid and attractive. And if the U.S. does those sanctions, that basically shifts the relationship between China and Russia, because China buys extremely discounted oil. And if Russian oil basically shifts to market prices, that creates some big money-making opportunity for the Russians. So it hits China in really interesting ways, both from the economic side, but also from the normative side, right? If weaponization of choke points like Strait of Hormuz, Iran has somehow rationalized, and it has, I think, not legitimized its rationalization, but it attempted economic suicide on Hormuz and has actually been able to weaponize the choke point in a way that gives it leverage over the U.S. And if you're an Iranian and you're looking at Trump's response to to Iran's engagement in Hormuz, you're probably grinning right now, being like, "Oh well, we always thought that we had that leverage, but we didn't."
I mean, Jesse, one has to be honest. Everyone in the world is grinning, even people who despise the Iranian regime. It's impossible not to see this as a comeuppance,
I think it depends. I mean, if you're
I mean, nobody's going to be grinning when you're starving.
When you're pumping oil.
Because of a recession, I'm not going to be, when I'm like sewing my leg back on after Civil War, I won't be grinning so much. But there is some schadenfreude about in the idea of Trump screwing it up so badly. I mean, you see that in even the kind of memes being generated by the Iranian propaganda machine and some of the Chinese cartoons I've seen,
But until more money flows back into Moscow, which is pumped back into Ukraine, the Europeans are very clear.
No, everybody's going to suffer. I shouldn't be glib. I should not.
No.
Things are going to be bad. Things are going to be very bad for everybody.
And And some people are trying to figure out, okay, is this kind of a death nail in China's economy? Are the new projections for this year going to be shaped by the war? I don't really know. It's hard for me to say. I have general assumptions that I will, like hypotheses that I want to test. But I think in general, this has not been a net positive for China.
No.
I think the longer the war goes on, provided China's able to insulate its economy sufficiently, it does provide opportunity for Beijing in the long term, in terms of just projecting its image, providing alternatives. Because 6 months is a very long time for people to be like, oh yeah, you know what? We shouldn't be reliant on Hormuz anymore. Let's try to readjust global shipping,
Mm.
global freight. You saw the Saudis recently just announced a new, I think, like 1,800-kilometer rail track that they just kind of
Mm.
finished putting together. Like the world is looking for alternatives because when you have a choke point, it drives the need to innovate new options and new pathways. So effectively, the longer the war goes on, that's what this is going to do. Is it's going to reduce the long-term importance of Hormuz, even if it's just countries waking up being like, this might take us 10 years, but we need to reduce dependency.
And of course, I mean, the other area where China will benefit is just the big picture, right? I mean, the Economist cover, I think, came out this week with
Mhm.
picture of, Xi Jinping, like, it's kind of based on that meme, like, do nothing, watch, Trump fuck everything up. And it's difficult not to draw that conclusion. It's not just the change in the trade patterns and, avoiding the Persian Gulf. It's also that America really has irrecoverably lost its reputation of being reliable. I mean, this isn't going to recover in 5 years or 10 years. This is a kind of straight a Suez Canal type of event to happen to a superpower that
Yeah.
has diminished its standing around the world, and it won't be recovered. And I mean, I think even if you look at the fact that they were unable to execute regime change, if I was in Beijing, I would take some heart for that, because the Iranians are much poorer and much worse equipped, and much less organized, and much smaller in number. And if you're the Communist Party, you say, well, they're doing just fine despite all that technology from the US.
But
But what do you make of the 5-point initiative of China and Pakistan for restoring peace and stability in the Gulf and Middle East region? So this is a plan released March 31 by China and Pakistan.
just for those who may not be familiar, so the plan basically outlines an immediate ceasefire to start.
Yeah, please do outline the plan.
Protecting civilians. No, no worries. Protection of civilians and non-military infrastructure, which is one I want to come back to because the strikes on AI are fascinating.
Right.
And for China, I think to see this raised in a point is particularly important for the GCC. Then basically upholding shipping lanes and then upholding the primacy of UN Charter. Um, the whole statement, as is written, is deliberately uncontroversial. No surprise. Um, to me, though, there's nothing in this initiative that any party would formally object to.
It's basically saying, let's all
Yeah.
get along, kumbaya, let's stop fighting and be groovy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it also requires no one to make any form of concession. I mean, that's kind of the core point here. And
Yeah.
it tends to be China, for folks who are not aware of kind of generally Chinese mediation, right? This is the preferred diplomatic mode, right? It's laying out the core principles that project responsibility without assuming any kind of real risk. I do think what's interesting is Beijing voicing this to Pakistan. There has been a lot of engagement between the Gulf countries and Pakistan and Turkey, which does set an interesting precedent for the potential for a mini-lateral kind of grouping of countries to try to bring in the US and China together for some form of dialogue. I think Wang Yi has publicly endorsed Pakistan's mediation efforts, but it really comes down to action, right? To me, this is not a peace plan because it does not propose any form of enforcement, any mechanisms, timelines, or consequences. This was a similar critique that was laid out for the Saudi Iran deal, right? That there was no formal means of enforcement. For a number of Chinese scholars and observers, right, that showed exactly what Chinese influence was meant to be, right? Non-coercive, neutral, bringing parties together to the table that want to be together. The reality is none of those parties want to be together. So there has to be some form of coercion process. And there are debates within mediation communities about how that coercion is used or
Right.
coercion is used. Beijing is not going to apply that force. And there's also a second layer to that, which is Beijing is most likely not going to endorse unless they receive a tacit invitation from the US. I had conversations with folks on both sides who at differing times have told me, well, the US might potentially look at a Chinese role in de-escalation after this kind of slows down, but we would need the Chinese to approach us. We're not going to ask. And then I've heard on the other side from Beijing at different times, right? We would happily be willing to engage to the extent that we can contribute. But we want the US to kind of signal to us to bring us in. So you get two countries that are more or less interested in de-escalation, particularly before the conflict started, But neither are willing to actually like take the first step to initiate the process.
or in
Um,
any way put their money where their mouth is.
I mean, the U.S. put its money where its mouth was, and I think that's partially the problem, right? Is they
Yeah,
think
yeah,
it works.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's always the problem with the US.
Uh,
It puts its money where its bombs are.
yeah,
Yeah,
but I do think within the language though, it is China's implicit way of telling the Iranians that it will hedge against them with the rest of the region, right?
right.
Because it does push back against, or it does push back against their attacks on the Gulf. And I think that's important, right? China doesn't necessarily have to say that directly, though it is probably signaling it quite powerfully privately.
Yeah,
So I just think laying it out as this is kind of it's a framework with no enforcement, it's a framework with no capacity, it's not a peace plan.
right,
Um,
right. And
but
there's sort of other pieces, other discussions of could China stop the Houthis from, being naughty and this kind of thing. Well,
if I could add
yeah,
one point here
please.
though, because I don't want to be the eternal pessimist here. Like
Yeah,
I've
that's my
engaged
job.
I've engaged quite extensively for over the last year, I want to say over the last few years, on this issue. There are a lot of opportunities for cooperation. I don't want to be the negative Nancy here. And I know I recently wrote a paper basically arguing that China's been aligned on ends, but it's divided on means. Like the since the war started, like those overlaps are narrow. But
You,
I
you know,
do think there's opportunity.
and let's get to that paper about aligned
Sure.
and environments. Before we get there, you mentioned AI and China's
Yeah.
interest in AI in the Gulf. Let's go back to that and could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I will try not to talk your ear off too much because that is my PhD at the moment, basically looking at Gulf AI
Okay, so
in
I asked the
competition for
big
the US and
one.
China.
Boom.
Exactly. No, but
All right,
the
go.
simple answer is the Iranians set a new precedent by basically attacking Gulf AI infrastructure. And the reason is that in the Iranian perspective, the IRGC perspective, this was a legitimate military target because the US was running AI, basically its AI workloads that it was using for targeting and surveillance through those systems. So this and the Iranian view justified strikes on AWS facilities, so Amazon Web Services in the UAE and uh, I'm forgetting Bahrain. Sorry, in China, I've been tracking a lot of the narrative. Like from March 1, the day that this first started, there was a massive proliferation of discourse and conversation on Chinese social media. That was absolutely fascinating to me, from scholars to random AI chatbots, peoples with little bubble dolls talking about basically how this sets a new precedent. There was a huge amount of criticism of the US even using AI. There was less so criticism of Iran for targeting the infrastructure. But when I saw the inclusion of this and the 5 point plan, I was interested because I'm like, from people I know, they know this is an escalation. They know this is not a good escalation, but it's not a good escalation on both sides.
Mm,
Because if the US is utilizing AI in its targeting, right, we saw this big debate play out between Anthropic
mm,
and the Pentagon just weeks ago. If
mm,
the US is utilizing this and pursuing deeper integration of AI into its military operations, this creates a really interesting laboratory for China to watch how successful it is.
mm.
And that engenders a debate within China around AI ethics and defense integration, right?
Right,
What if they began to do the same type of thing?
right.
How do they? So far, most of the kind of the narrative and discourse I've seen has actually been quite opposed, being like, no, this reinforces that China needs its own kind of autarkic AI infrastructure, but there needs to be very clear safeguards around which it is integrated into the defense infrastructure. I think that's generally where the world is at as a baseline. So the US
Mm.
took the first step into deploying it. I mean, go back to the nuclear bomb, right? Very different context, right? But like the US is again taking a big step of integrating AI into the battlefield, and that
Right,
creates
right,
potential long-term challenges.
right. I mean, there is an American mindset. The one of the Palantir executives, Alex Karp, was recently on some stage, and he was saying the key product or the key value of the United States is lethality. It's like the ability to kill people. That's what America does. That's what we're in the business of. So,
I mean,
uh,
in terms
yeah.
of the monopoly of force, but again, here lies another opportunity, right? The EU
Mm,
tends to be the standard setter when it comes to AI. The Gulf is,
mm,
potentially the third AI hub
mm.
in the world, and the U.S. and China have competing models of which they're basically racing to the
Right.
best form of frontier model. Um, why not have a conversation? I mean,
Yeah.
obviously there are massive differences between what people in DC call authoritarian AI and in China, for example, and I think what people in the West are beginning to look at USAI and be like, uh, you're killing people in the battlefield.
Yeah, maybe that's maybe those communists have a couple of good ideas. That they
well, the news headline on the Washington Post or New York Times should not be about Anthropic getting their contracts ripped out because they decided they were not going to let the Pentagon either deploy it for surveillance of U.S. forces or U.S. citizens, or even more crazier, right? Fully autonomous weapons with no humans involved in the process.
No, and you have the Secretary of Defense basically saying no limits. We don't want any limits of any kind. So yeah.
All of the norms, including in Iran, right? The big issue that the Chinese have taken up in their rhetoric is around targeting of civilians, right?
Yeah,
civilians. The world has been talking about this.
Yeah,
mentality.
So, how about drones? Like in the discourse you've been kind of watching on Iran, on the war, or drones, because obviously that's it started with Ukraine, but it seems to me that the world has now really become aware that drones are, a major part of modern warfare.
I mean, it's been even pre-Ukraine, right? There were small scale drones that were being flown in Syria going back to like the late 2010s, so like 2017, 18, 19. So I think, and even just generally, like countering drones has been a big form of defense technology innovation for a long time to try to, when you've got places, there's always been the risk, right, of something flying over and hitting Israel. Like all of Iron Dome is designed for that. The difference with drones is how cheaply is the thing that you're flying at them, and B, how big is it, right? So we went from like a school bus. Sorry, my hands are out here. Went from a school bus to a Honda Accord to a Walmart truck. So,
what more difficult to protect, cheap, to launch,
and it basically gives an asymmetric capability to states that normally would not have it. And
so that's a great explanation of the of drones, and obviously it isn't in fact new, as you pointed out, but. How are Chinese people talking about it, or Chinese defense type commentary?
It's not a discourse I've been tracking as closely.
Really? Okay.
But I think in general they're watching and seeing how successful Iranian drones have been. Right. Initially, I think we saw less precise attacks early on, but as the Iranian rate of deployment has decreased, we have seen its precision increase. So, and I've heard rumors. I don't know. But if the Iranians are using Big Oak, or using Chinese GPS systems, right, there's more training capacity there. So there's always been this defense integration between the two, to the extent that China is supporting or helping with targeting or intelligence collection. It's hard to assess. I'm not entirely sure.
There've been a couple of media stories about both Russia.
Yeah, and I don't want to
right. But they seem fairly thinly sourced.
Yeah, and I don't want to speculate too far in that region, but I think it's safe to say that if typically China deploys a system, in any case, if the U.S. deploys a system, it's either training the people using it or it's sending it to people there to train. So I do think that there is some viability to the idea that China has been to some extent supporting just basic planning and operations. Maybe they're not during periods of combat. I don't actually know, but just generally within kind of how you sell weapons, you have to train the people how to use them. So that is within the realm of the possibility. But it's interesting, right? I think I'm less concerned about how China views drones. I mean, maybe in the sense of like drone swarms and some of these other things, right, that China's been planning and people have been theorizing and talking about. I've seen scary academic literature, both out of Beijing, out of really any defense school or kind of innovation network that's looking at how do you deploy drones for war. Like, it's scary because you reduce the direct impact of the user and you increase the impact of kind of who's getting hit. So I think in any case, like, it plays that same kind of narrative as AI. How do you restrain the worst effects of these? And again, another
and that's not new.
China should have a real dialogue.
I remember, I think it was Michael Moore's film Fahrenheit's 417, where he shows an American drone pilot. This was the Iraq War, Bush's Iraq War, and the guy is like killing people, playing video games, killing actual people. And then he drives home and he's got this kind of perfect TV soap opera, middle-class life with us. Hi, honey, I'm home and dinner's ready. And, so, I mean, that does exercise imagination.
It exercises imagination, but also like the PTSD rate among drone pilots or just like drone operators is really high.
Really? Yeah.
Like, it's like the psychological impact of smashing a bug And then when you
Yeah.
conceptualize that person, right, you either have to dehumanize them sufficiently to not care, or you deal with the traumatic notions of what you're
Right.
actually doing. And I think, again, the human element and all of this, I think, is the key factor.
Yeah.
Even in the context of Iran,
Yeah.
um, one point I'll add to that is because there is such a limited stream of information coming out of Iran about the impact because of Iranian, kind of just general blackouts of the internet, it is harder to humanize, whether it was the protests, whether it's the human impact. Like UNHCR put out a report, he's around 3.2, this was a week and a half ago, 3.2 million people displaced. I've worked on Syria for about 10 years, particularly on displacement. It was one of the areas. Like I can conceptualize what that looks like because I've been to Syria, I've met with people who've been displaced, I've been to the camps. For the average American, a war in Iran looks like a just war until you see the impact. And I think that human element is also missing in many cases in China and other areas. So I think how a war is fought is always linked to the audiences that are watching it. And I'll pause there because I know that gets a bit into the piece that we wanted to talk about.
Well, let's get into the piece then. So US China are aligned on ends, but divided on means in the Iran war. A slightly contentious. I mean, to say that the US and China are aligned on any kind of ends is an interesting statement. So why don't you talk about this piece that you published in a Gulf newspaper?
International Forum. Yeah, Gulf
International Forum. Yeah.
DC based, really great folks, really good. I'm saying there's a lot of actually, for people who are not understanding the Iran crisis, there's a lot of really good think tanks right now who are doing events. Gulf International Forum is one of them, but there are a number of them. And the reason I flag that is there's no substitute about learning about a crisis than hearing from the people who are
talking to people who actually know what
exactly.
Yeah.
But who also are in the region, adjacent to the region, talking to people in the region, right? If you can find a think tank or organization that has contacts, just talking to someone in Tehran, for example, an analyst, like Hassan Ahmadian is an Iranian academic who's at the University of Tehran, who has been on Al Jazeera talking about this stuff live. Like those types of engagements you can't find a substitute for that because those are the people living and engaging with the actors who are making decisions around this. So I say that. I've been a part of a few conversations over the last year or so. And often when we go into a track 2 dialogue or track 1.5, the core question, and for people who are wondering, that's basically where you bring together, policymakers at like a track 1.5 is where you have some official representation in the room for a dialogue around a specific issue. Track 2 is like when you bring together academics, policymakers, retired experts to talk about how to create basically a path forward on a specific issue.
And let me ask a dumb question about these things. Who pays for track 1.5 and track 2? Is it universities and think tanks and governments or like a combination?
I think it depends. It depends on the country. It depends on the institution, right? In some cases, you may see Gulf countries funding these because there's an interest in finding a diplomatic way forward. Sometimes the outputs of these, right, try to actually create movement.
But I mean, I guess, so say if you went to do an event, say in China, the Center on China and Globalization, would that count as like a track 2 dialogue if there was no official involvement?
It would. I think it would depend. So think about it this way: if you're going to host a 7-8 hour, maybe a 2-day conference, and the theme is how to here's a really interesting one. Can the U.S., China, and the Arab world cooperate to reduce the potential for escalation between Iran and the Gulf states? Very relevant, very simple. It's one that's happened a fair number of times globally. If it happens in Beijing, it's likely that some of the funding is either coming from a private donor or from an organ of the Chinese government or a university. If it's coming from the U.S., it could be from a think tank, it could be from a foundation. It just really depends. There's a large number of hosts, but the objective here is to basically find breakthrough to kind of build trust through engagement and to kind of push past some of the, I would say, misunderstandings if we're thinking in the security dilemma approach, like how to break through some of the misunderstandings that the other side may have.
And then are more difficult to do in informal official
communication. Exactly. And typically the output of those aims to reinforce policymakers' knowledge to be able to find breakthroughs in certain issues. So in the case of
I kind of made you go on a big diversion. So.
No worries. No, I'm pulling back in. Don't worry, I'm pulling back in. But I think on that question, right? So let's just throw out the real question I was trying to answer as I was digging into this piece is, are there overlaps? And I've had sufficient conversations with folks from Tehran and the Arab world in Washington and in Beijing, there are certainly overlaps. And I'll go into those in a second. The difficulty is the overlaps that existed prior to this conflict and realistically prior to the 12-Day War were wider. Again, I ignore
Yeah.
Cameronism. They're wider. But after the 12-Day War, they shrunk slightly. And then
Right.
after the current conflict, because it's still being fought, they've slimmed. And I think the convergence is important and identifying is important. Before the war, there were a large number of opportunities. You saw the potential to discuss enrichment. So I should look, the base of all of this is the US and China generally agree that they do not want a nuclear armed Iran.
Mm.
And I think that is an important foundation to set because that is the floor. And
Mm.
honestly, that is a very important floor in which you can build quite a robust either dialogue or framework of engagement.
Mm.
In theory, though, that requires two actors working together with a committed interest. The difference for the US and China is they diverge significantly on the means to do that.
Mm.
Um, why? In terms of the shared interest, is neither of them wants to see an Iran nuclear weapon. None of them want to see the cascade that nuclear Iran would trigger in terms of non-proliferation, right? It threatens the potential NPT framework, which China tends to view as foundational to its own security interests. And Iran, we've already seen threaten to withdraw from the NPT following North Korea's precedent years back. And no power in the US or China had a credible, viable plan to move forward. Now, the Chinese look at the Americans and say, well, you withdrew from the JCPOA, so that undermined the framework we have. The Gulf states and the Americans look at Iran and the rest of the world, including Biden and Obama, and say, well, your negotiations with the JCPOA were fundamentally flawed because they didn't actually undermine Iran's influence. It just changed how they went about destabilizing. So that understanding of the shared agreement created depending like diverging pathways. For China, I think the key point is they don't believe in the use of force, they don't believe in sanctions, and they don't believe in regime change. And what have you seen in the last 2 years from the U.S. now? You've seen the use of force, you've seen the deployment of sanctions going back, but escalating, and now you've seen regime or attempts at regime change, and including the direct assassination of the head of state. That creates very, very, very differing understandings of the current environment, but it also creates, I think, for China, a sense of repellent that it does not want to be engaged with the U.S. around the Iranian issue. That doesn't mean other things cannot be sidelined. But because China categorically opposes all of these things, it really reduces the potential that you can cooperate. So in the paper, I kind of, at first I thought it was a joke, but the more that I was actually outlining is like, well, ahead of the Xi meeting, right? Because this was actually before the 12-Day War, but then now, there were hopes that when Trump and Xi actually meet, if there wasn't conflict and there was progress, even after the 12-Day War, that there would be the space to have a conversation privately and publicly signal together that basically non-proliferation is still the status quo and
Mm.
neither country wants to see a new nuclear power.
Yeah.
Why that's important is the Iranians get basically the Chinese get to signal to the Iranians, also to the North Koreans, about nuclear proliferation, and the US gets to declare when that it was able to cooperate with China toward a shared agreement. And that's what I mean, we might think of it in very small terms, and we may think of it as window dressing. But in theory, for the US, that's a big win to have a public statement. To share a fundamental agreement that converges on the Iran question. Because on top of that, again, as a foundation, you can then build conversations of, okay, so then if you want enrichment, what does enrichment look like? Is it 3.8%? Where's the threshold? You also now have Saudi Arabia looking at nuclearizing, which means enrichment. So then what does it mean then if the Iranians get to enrich at a certain point, then the Saudis engage in the conversation? There's been a lot of really interesting ideation around, can you build kind of an Iranian civil nuclear capacity and a Gulf civil nuclear capacity in a way that has a shared enrichment frame? Like there's so many differing understandings in these conversations.
Mm.
All
But I
of
mean,
that,
all
all
of
of that
that is
infrastructure
blown up
collapsed.
now, right? Right.
That's
That's all
the key
gone,
point.
right?
And
Yeah.
that infrastructure has collapsed. I don't think I think there is a world where you
Yeah.
can bring it back.
Yeah.
But the fundamental power dynamics with Iran, you now have a weakened but increasingly aggressive and just based on their own operations in Hormuz confident IRGC that has relatively firm control. I don't know to the extent that it's sustainable, but generally people I speak with say they've prepared for roughly around a 6-month conflict. A lot can happen in 6 months. Um, things could go absolutely sideways. And we could look at Syria in 2011 happening in Iran, with the protest movement becoming an armed kind of ground incursion that creates. But it could also just be that the IRGC cements its control and the US basically is dragged into a longitudinal conflict, which theoretically, even though Trump doesn't have political ends on the table, the US Department of Defense, or I guess Department of War now, has been planning for a scenario like this for at least 2 decades. So we can go into the risk calculations of, how many interceptors have been burned through. All those are great questions. But the reality is in many cases, the Department of Defense has been planning for the eventuality that a Gulf crisis would break out again. But that leaves China in a really tough position because they are basically allergic to engagements with the US on this specific issue. Now, there are conversations that are happening that continue to happen, right? If the Pakistanis are talking to the Chinese, they're also certainly doing shoulder diplomacy with the Gulf and the US. So there is a back behind the scenes conversation, which emerged quite interestingly as the role of potentially JD Vance as the ones that the Iranians will accept as the negotiator.
Because they trust a religious nut job, or what's the logic, do you think? Or
JD
Steve Witkoff?
JD rhetorically, publicly, he has been against the invasion.
Oh, because of the anti-war, right?
Yes, and I think that position makes him a more pragmatic and more predictable, key point, predictable person who is willing to pragmatically speak about what does it take to reach an understanding between the Gulf, between the US, between China, between all the core actors around the nuclear issue. Where things get really sticky and where the divergence gets worse is a question of, basically Rubio and Trump pushing on things like ballistics and others. Like these are the kind of the red line of the Israelis laid out, kind of the 4 priorities of what needs to be removed. So nuclear weapons, no enriched uranium, the removal of existing enriched uranium, and 5, no ballistic missile program, and stopping the support for proxies across the region.
For proxies, which are primarily, it's the Houthis, Hamas, and Hezbollah. Is that right?
Yeah, so there's people debate on the depth of the ties of Hamas. I'm not going to get into that, but generally that tends to be how the Israelis and others see that tie. But the strongest are in Iraq and Lebanon with Hezbollah and the Houthis in Yemen. And we won't get into that now, but China has a huge oil presence in Iraq. And Iraq is one of, I think it's their second or third largest kind of oil importer.
Built after the last American misadventure in that part.
Exactly.
Right.
Which raises a number of other questions about how they stand to gain in a post-regional reconstruction period.
One can see how things might pan out quite easily, can't one?
Exactly. But again, that adds then to the risk exposure that China faces, right? When we try to evaluate how China's thinking about the region, like they haven't ordered the evacuations of their staff out of the Gulf. They have largely out of Iran. There's been thousands of people evacuated out. Iraq generally, I don't want to say it's stable, but Iraq is teetering, but has not basically collapsed into any kind of real kind of sub-conflict other than a few rockets being fired by Iranian militias. But that's, again, something to watch. And Chinese oil interests there are also threatened. So imagine there is a spillover if the U.S. does carry out a ground invasion. Then if Iraq is destabilized and China now faces pressure on its oil supplies from Iraq, from all of the Gulf countries, and from Iran. So that either shifts its dependency fully to Russia, it has to burn its reserves quicker, or it has to start looking internally to say, okay, how do we slow exports and kind of secure a lot of these strategic reserves so that we can continue trying to, so it doesn't basically slow down forever. So it does change the rationale. So there's an incentive on China's side to solve the problem, to work to solve the problem. But again, the means, how do we get to that point, largely was flushed down the toilet with the invasion recently. The key moment to watch for, and this is what I was mentioning at the start of today, is the Xi-Trump meeting that was supposed to happen in March, even though the invitation was never formally extended, was meant to be the moment where there would at least be an understanding on all of the pressure that was building up to the Iran war and a return to the negotiations. The aim was to use that moment to basically create some form of shared understanding between the US and China on what what Iranian behavior should look like, and then how to create a pathway to get there. Now, I think it's a dream to have that extent of coordination, but the Chinese have shown, and I do believe that even though the 5-point plan is confetti in many ways, the subtext and the sublayer of that conversation is the Chinese have been actively engaging. And I have spoken with a few people in Beijing who are adamant that Beijing is serious about wanting to find a way through kind of the current, I don't know, muddy water to kind of find a way through on the other side. But again, it really doesn't come down to the why; it comes down to the how. And I
Right,
think
right.
how right now means some form of coercion to bring either side. No country really has the ability to coerce the U.S. at scale, though the Iranians are doing a pretty impressive job. The Chinese are not going to really push against the U.S. unless there's a signal inviting their role. And for me, the only way that you actually get that moment is there has to be some pragmatic trade off. I don't know if that's an agreement on critical minerals or rare earths. That's going to happen most likely in a completely different sector, completely different political
And
regime.
all of this seems so unimaginable given, the Trump regime and Xi Jinping's government. I mean, it's like,
No one thought Trump was going to open Nvidia chip sales to China.
no, no. I mean, yeah,
So
all kinds of things can happen.
the
That's
the
absolutely
call
true. Yeah.
the call ended. I mean, the call effectively ended, right?
Mm.
Chinese rare earth, like at least a 1 year extension on China's rare earth blockades, and then China then gets access to NVIDIA H200s. Causation and correlation, I'm not sure. I'm
But
not
anything could
saying
happen.
right. Like this is an
Yeah, yeah,
administration that if there's
yeah,
enough creative thinking, not always
yeah,
saying good creative thinking, that there is a potential way forward. We could see peace tomorrow.
yeah.
Trump has been able to do that to kind of reverse course. Maybe in 9 minutes, we'll see him be like, oh, all right, everyone, the war is over. JD negotiated peace. Let's go. Woo. I don't think that's obviously going to happen, but it
Yeah, I
does.
mean, there's kind of the problem of having completely destroyed another country's infrastructure. So it's, I mean, this is one where the magic Trump effect, the Teflon Trump, I don't know.
Yeah.
So you talk in that article a little bit about China's CIPS, I do pronounce it CIPS,
Yeah.
payments platform and financial sanctions. And Beijing obviously has spent many years building workarounds or trying to build workarounds to the US financial system, which gives it so much power and enables it to, sanction people, close people's bank accounts and stuff like that. There's been quite a popular like animation that seems to have an Iranian source kind of satirizing Trump. And part of it shows these Chinese flagged ships steaming through the Strait of Hormuz, and then money, I think denominated in yuan, kind of piling up that the Iranians are getting. There is this kind of idea in the popular culture that the dollar is gonna go and the yuan is gonna take over, and somehow this is the opportunity for China to kind of become, the era of the petro yuan could be here. How bring some reality to this, and how do we look at the payment system, the way Iran pays for oil, China's attempts to set up alternative payments networks? What is important for us to understand at this moment?
I think starting with Chinese core interests here, right? And going back to what is their relationship with Iran. And one of the strategic functions is that it keeps the US distracted and it keeps pressure on the US in the Middle East. So that enables, right? China can benefit from cheap oil. Like, there's a lot of economic incentives, but then you also have the constant redeployment and shifting of US forces out of China's area of responsibility and region to the Middle East. So, that's a mass expensive US resources funding to basically have to, give China a break. And then escalate conversations around Taiwan and some of these other areas. But the sanctions piece is important in that China has constantly, despite its frustrations with Iran, despite its frustrations even with Syria and other places, has always been adamant that sanctions should not be a tool used for economic coercion because it sets a negative precedent that you can basically weaponize economic interdependence to isolate a country, and it creates worse decision makings down the line and reduces the incentive to negotiate. We're seeing that play out in real ways. Now, I think for Chinese companies, it has been very lucrative, right? When you were the only supplier, when you were the supplier of last resort for Iran, you can make a lot of money because you can set the price on a lot of things. And I think the payment system is basically one of, and I say one of because I think there are many, many different ways, some of which I'm not even tracking, that Beijing can make money and basically move cash, and whether it's selling resources, however, with the Iranians. But basically, yeah, it weaponized the renminbi to be able to create a kind of loophole to U.S. weaponization of SWIFT. And I think that's the key point. It's like the U.S. historically has used SWIFT as a choke point with North Korea, with Iran, with other countries as a means of trying to shape behavior. Those countries, because of backdoor channels And just, I think also because of just the autarkic approach to economic resistance, I guess you could say, in terms of revolution against the US, have made ecosystems that can function and survive with limited cash reserves and access. And the reason I
Right.
say that is Iran has been able to build its missile stockpile, arm regional proxies, and acquire the necessary inputs to continue all of these networks without really the use of dollars. So when we
Mm.
look at how that circulation of capital and cash through the RMB is floating, that's where frustration in the US comes in and says, well, you are actually enabling Iran in all of these different aspects because you are giving them that lifeline. If you just choke them out, or you choke out their ability to access these, and they're willing to come to the table. And I think the Chinese position is no, that is unrealistic and delusional. Um, and I mean, generally, what we've seen, I mean, it was in the moment, to kind of throw some cold water on the internationalization of the yuan and undermining the dollar. The Russians were like, well, the ruble looks like a pretty stable currency at the moment. We've got rich, large amounts of oil. Trump recently lifted sanctions on us, at least some of
Right.
our reserves. Um, so it's tis the season for every country that has a currency wants to internationalize to be like, hey guys, we can become the new currency for oil trade,
Right.
or for oil purchases. So I mean, it has like this trend has undercut U.S. sanctions in Iran, but it hasn't
Right.
ended the like just searing pain and the chokehold that sanctions do provide, right? Because
Right.
companies in China will spend lots of money on risk consulting firms to figure out exactly whether they're going to be exposed to secondary sanctions if they continue doing certain types of engagement, right? We still see Chinese teapot refineries and shipping companies that are moving through the UAE and other places getting sanctioned. So
But
this has
refineries
been
being kind of small scale, independent.
yeah, the teapot ones. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah, these teapot refineries. I think in Shandong and different places.
Mm.
So, it's been a residual part of the discourse for many years.
Mm.
Um, but I think the current moment just kind of shakes up the whole conversation because now, I don't think the Chinese take this seriously, but the Iranians are kind of playing this. Well, if you pay us an RMB, we'll let you through at a certain minimum level. Or, you hear stories of ships basically saying, "Oh, yeah, all of our staff are Chinese," and being allowed through.
Right.
So it seems like a bit of a scramble for companies to figure out how to get their ships safely through. I mean, the Iranians are kind of latching onto that trend and be like, well, might as well exploit them, pay us. Again, another source of capital. And realistically, when you control a choke point, when you look at the U.S. with semiconductors, or you look at China with rare earths, you can set the price. You can either floor out competition, or you can surge the price. You can de
Mm.
facto determine who gets access to what. But again,
Mm.
you can only do that so long. Because when you look at the history of the weaponization of checkpoints, you see that this drives innovation in other ways to find other, basically build new routes, like you mentioned with going back to the wow, I'm forgetting Egypt and the
The
my
Suez
brain.
Canal.
Yeah,
Right.
the Suez
Yeah.
crisis.
Yeah.
As a Middle East scholar and Arabic speaker, I feel ashamed.
You're jet
Uh,
lagged. You're in Vietnam, but your body thinks you're in, Budapest or somewhere.
too
So
many. I need more
yeah,
coconut coffees. I
yeah,
claims to my
coffee,
discovery
coffee.
here. Vietnamese coffee,
Which
but
city
it's
are you in?
feeling.
All right.
I'm in Ho Chi Minh right now.
Okay. Nice.
Yeah. But I think yeah, I think the salience of sanctions is still present. Um, what this is doing more generally, and I think what
Mhm.
divorcing this from Iran is, it is allowing China and it is allowing countries that are resistant to the idea of U.S. kind of force and monopoly over SWIFT to build alternative payment systems that reduce the pressure on interconnected, interdependent economies. So BRICS,
Mhm.
on the SCO, other countries that have cooperation that are impacted by their banks or their shipping companies or their insurance are impacted by SWIFT is basically to build the SWIFT alternative. And CIPS to an extent is becoming part of that infrastructure, but it's not just that, right? And it's going to require a lot more, right? Because you're going to have to convince banks to potentially risk SWIFT access to defect from that ecosystem to basically
Mhm.
be able to invest in and basically allow cash flow to countries that are quite unstable, quite
Mhm.
erratic, quite
Mhm.
volatile. It's not
Mhm.
necessarily the best selling point in the long term.
Mhm.
So it
Mhm.
takes more political will, which
Mhm.
typically if you're a centralized economy and you're a centrally managed and governed economy, it's easier to kind of push state entities to do that.
Yeah.
And again, that's where the pressure from the US comes. It's against China and Chinese banks. It's like This is not helping the situation. But then the counter is, well, neither are your sanctions. And meanwhile, Iran's there being like, hey, if you want to cross through, just pay us $1 million, you're good to go. So that
Wow.
whole dynamic transforms this entire conversation.
Yeah, yeah. Oh my gosh, this is it's so fascinating. We're hitting, in fact, exactly an hour, which I think is about right for the average listener and for you because you need to go and get some more coffee. But let me ask one last question, which is so. I mean, where the State of the Union's about to start. Lord knows what the old guy's going to say.
You have
But
your
in
bingo
what
card yet? Bingo.
just you know.
I'm the greatest president ever. No,
Well, yeah, I
my best
mean,
attempt.
sure, of course, of course, of course. But what do you think we should watch to try and kind of see how things will shake out from China's point of view? Like, what do you think are the you know, is it diplomatic statements? Are there like oil numbers that we should be looking at, or what are the signs that we will see that China is deciding to do something, or that something new is happening in China's relationship with both Iran and the other Gulf states?
If past is prologue, and it normally is, and even in the conflict, follow the diplomatic path of the special envoy Jai Jun, where he goes, where he's doing civil diplomacy, who he's speaking with, what public statements are coming out from his engagements. You will see where China's engagement is happening, where civil diplomacy is happening,
Hmm.
and then on the layer beneath that, you can begin to see, okay, what states is he meeting with, what kind of mini-lateral grouping or like multilateral grouping of small communities. Of many-lateral, for folks who may not know, is basically when 2, 3, 4 different countries that don't necessarily share a lot in common come together to try to solve a specific issue set, a very limited, narrow blend of cooperation. So in this, is China coordinating and cultivating kind of a mini-lateral to be able to either constrain Iran or work with Iran and others to kind of bring together a solution? I think there is a pathway. Again, I'm trying to be an optimist in this specific case. In my
It's your
conversations
job here.
yeah, and in my conversations, there is in theory a pathway. Um, there's a lot of backdoor
Okay,
conversations
Optimist, stop
happening.
there. Last,
No,
I'm
no,
going
no,
to
no,
actually
but
add one more question.
there's one last piece on this which we haven't
Okay.
touched on, and I'm not going to get to. The key spoiler in a lot of this is the Israelis still have a de facto veto
We have not
through
talked about the
continued
Israelis at all
through
in this
continued
whole
airstrikes, and
conversation,
I'm
which is
not going
kind
to
of
get
the
into
elephant
that.
in the room. Yeah.
But I do want to flag because I think any agreement, even if the U.S. reaches an agreement with China and with Iran, with the Gulf on a way forward, if the Israelis are not on board, they still hold a de
Mm.
facto veto card by continuing the conflict. Because if they continue to fight, if they continue to advance, attack critical infrastructure, the Iranians will again continue to attack the Gulf in retaliation. And that then keeps the US involved in this process. So
Right.
that
Right.
component,
Right.
the Chinese understand that, the Iranians understand that, the Israelis know that, and the Americans are worried. And I think
Yeah.
that is still the
Yeah.
biggest factor. When I engage with Beijing, colleagues in
Right.
Beijing, when I engage with mediators, they don't know how to bring the Israelis into an umbrella of a negotiation in the current moment. And then there's the underlying question of what changes that calculus for Israel. I'll pause there.
And we could do another 10 hours on the Chinese relationship with Israel. Okay, I'll one last question then. Jai Jun, the diplomat, you said he's the guy to watch. So Chinese diplomats, I mean, a lot of them are pretty, boring and replaceable characters, but there are a few that are, have something, and he appears to be one of them. Can you briefly introduce him?
Yeah, so he's been the special envoy. I mean, he's worked in the region. I can't track his whole resume, but I mean, he's been through the region. I believe through Gaza, and through Syria crises, and now again through the second Iran Persian Gulf crisis. So typically, like he basically was sent out. It was end of February to meet with regional actors. And I obviously, when you look at the hierarchy of officials, right, when you see someone like Wang Yi come through, it's going to be much more important. But I think the point with Jun was symbolically for China showing that they're engaged. It's the normal playbook. Go do show diplomacy, move between sides, see if there's space for engagement, build trust, reinforce kind of key points. But again, it's not any form of kind of coercive leverage. I am generally aware that the Chinese government is interested in finding a way forward on mediation. I think that has been present from every engagement I've had. I think there's still the key factor, whether that's with Zhejiang, whether that's with Wang Yi, whether that's with even a mill-to-mill dialogue. I'm not sure what that pattern looks like. Is the question of coercion. What does it take to bring the US, Israel, and Iran to the table and get all of them to have assured commitments, either with necessary leverage, these types of things are so fragile, they can break very easily. Like the network dependencies of these are pretty crucial in making sure that everyone is on board, feels safe, that there's trust in the agreement. The US has undermined that in all of the dialogue so far, attacking right after the mediations have occurred. So that decentralizes Chinese engagement. The Chinese can't build that trust. Zhejiang cannot build that trust. So from the Chinese side, the signal, it's hard to really understand what they can do. To me, the key moment is going to be the next engagement between Xi and Trump. Because if we know when that's going to be, if we have an idea, like when we were in March, you can then build up to that. They're going to be, say, a month or 2 months before. There's going to be an intensive exchange between Washington and Beijing and the Middle East, like think tanks and all these others, on a steady drumbeat of dialogues, being like, what can we propose that is realistic? We may actually have sub-level engagement between the White House and maybe lower-level Chinese officials. Like the idea is you have to create those linkages to have the conversation, to be able to find the way forward, and then propose that upward and get. Again, Trump can be temperamental on the best of days. It's hard to predict his decision making, but kind of create the perfect storm or the perfect sunny day, I guess, where President Xi and President Trump meet together, and they're like, "Hey, I have an idea that allows you to win and me win. Let's move forward." That's hard to resist.
Only rational people like you were in charge, Jesse. Everything. So on that note, I'm going to let you go and enjoy a beautiful morning.
Thank you. I'm a coffee snob.
You're a coffee.
Thank you. I'm a coffee snob, so my first enactment would be like a Vietnamese standard of coffee globally, but sadly most economies cannot afford that. China's like, we have Yunnan coffee, so we'll take care of it.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. A pleasure. Now I'm going to I'll see if I can shut us down without doing anything wrong. So if I just disappear, thank you very much to our audience, and thank you very much, Jesse.
Excellent. Cheers.
All right. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. How do I do this?
I think you just hit leave.